the final a part of our mini-series on anxiety, God and me. And what's really shocked me a little in some ways is I've shared some of these messages with other churches as well as our own church. And the amount of people that are really resonating with these words, that are really feeling these words, that are actually saying, you know what, Pastor Jim, I'm really struggling with anxiety. And the first series part of the message I shared on was focused on us and God and anxiety and how we can. Then last week I shared about how we can serve others with anxiety. And today I want to share about anxiety and the future. Because let's be honest, a lot of us, we're scared about the future. We may not be scared about everything in the future, but there's stuff that worries us. There's stuff that bothers us. You might be scared. You might be getting older, and you might be scared because you might be thinking, I've missed out on all the opportunities that have gone ahead. If you're younger, you could be scared about what grades you're going to get. If you're old, some of you might still be anxious that you're never going to find a husband or wife. Okay, some of you are anxious you might never be able to get a home. Some of you might be anxious because you think, what if my children make bad choices? Some of you are anxious of what will happen to you if your parents die. Some of you are fearful about your jobs disappearing. Some of you are going to be fearful about retiring. Some of you are fearful that the next funeral you attend will be yours. Some of you are fearful because of health of yours or a loved one. The list's huge, isn't it? Absolutely massive. And when I listed those things, I thought I know so many people who are fearful of that stuff. But also, I remember when I was a teenager, and another teenage friend of mine says, Jim, I've had a prophecy. I said, what was that prophecy? They said there was a prophetic word that I'm going to go to Europe when I'm 22 years old. This was her, not me. And I said, oh, that's amazing. She goes, yeah, it is. It means I'm guaranteed to be alive until 22 years old. I can relax. You know, however young or old you are, there is a little bit of fear that, you know what, death will come and get you eventually. And you have fear about your mortality. But that list that I just shared, when I read it, I thought actually it hit me a little bit. That was a very Western world perspective. Because there's many in the world today who are fearful that their children won't live until 5 years old. There are those that are fearful that they're going to be killed for their beliefs. There are those that are fearful that their shack or their house will be blown away. There are those who are fearful they'll have no food. There are those that are fearful that their Christianity will be discovered. There are those that are fearful that they won't get a visa and have to face the consequences of going home to a hostile place. Now, I haven't shared those with you to make your problem seem less. But I want to encourage you today that all of us, no matter what part of the world we're from, no matter what we're going through, are fearful for the future. You know, some of us, we have mixed emotions about what was going to happen. And for some of us, what induces fear induces excitement with some people. And what we get excited about with some people, other people get anxious about. And today I just want to hit briefly, just look about anxiety in the future. What can we do? And I want to focus on a character, King David, in the Bible. Now, King David is very famous in the Bible. He's the second king of Israel. And he was a young guy who was going places. He was a youngster who was going to be the next king. You know, as a 15-year-old, I wish that someone came up to me and told me I was going to be the next prime minister or king. Okay, I would have been excited. But David was a guy who was going to be the next king. He was going to be successful at whatever he did. And he was a real success. He was a brilliant harp player. He was brilliant at fighting. He was brilliant at shepherding. Whatever he did, he seemed to do really well. And he had God's plans on his life. And in the midst of his success and his talents, he had people wanting to kill him. You know, I get anxious at times. I'm not going to maybe pick my kids up from school on time, or I've got enough meetings to get to. David's anxieties were really serious. When people are trying to kill you, you have a right to be scared, don't you? He had a real right to be anxious at times. And he was often in hiding. And while he was in hiding and while he was feeling stressed, David would write songs and psalms. And I get the sense that as he was writing these, that he was writing them to reassure him of his hope that he had in God. To reassure him that times were going to get tough. But even when times are tough, that God was still with him. And at the beginning of the service, Margaret and Mohammed Reza read Psalm 23. And if you're listening online, I'd encourage you just to pause this meeting. Pause the, not the meeting, the button. Just read Psalm 27 before we continue. Because you know what, Psalm 27 is a really beautiful psalm. That's a real vulnerable psalm. That this king of Israel, this strong fighter, this guy who had everything going for him, opened up about what was making him scared. And this is what he says in verse 3. It says this, though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then I will be confident. And I love this verse. When I read these words, it feels like David is making a declaration. He's talking to himself and he's saying to himself, I'm not scared. I'm not going to be scared. You know when you watch the film and the person sits there and they're going through a dark corridor and they're going, I'm not going to be scared. I'm not going to be scared. I'm not going to be scared. I get the sense of David doing this in the hard situation, saying, I'm not going to be fearful. Talking to himself as characters do in a film. And I always say to you guys, at least recently I said it quite a lot, that if the Bible says, do not fear, or someone says, I'm not going to be afraid, you know what that normally means? They're scared. Okay, they're going through some anxiety at the time. And we don't know the exact situation that David was going through. But we know that it's tough, whatever he was facing. This guy who was called by God, this guy who was referred to as a man after God's own heart, this guy who was a warrior who defeated the giants, he's here acknowledging that life is hard and that he's fearful. But in that anxious place, he was making a choice to trust God. He goes on in verse 5 to say this, for in the day of trouble, he will keep me safe in his dwelling. He will hide me in his shelter, in his sacred tent. He set me high upon a rock. Now, a lot of us know that verse. If you've been around church for a while, you'll know this verse. But I love everything I've spotted this, and the thing actually gives me some encouragement. Is not the like, I'll hide you bit for God says, but it's this. It's the expectation that you will go through trials. You will have problems in life. Can you say to the person next to you, you will have problems in life? It's good to know that, isn't it? You will have problems in life. You kind of got to know it. You know, when this pandemic first hit, it was the first global problem that I've been a senior leader in. The last time when we had the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, I was a youth pastor. I didn't have to worry about that. That was someone else's worry. Okay, when the pandemic hit, I'm like, oh my goodness, I've got to lead the church through this. So I decided I was going to listen to as many leadership podcasts as I possibly could. And there was one pastor called Craig Rochelle, and he was a pastor in Oklahoma, and he talked about being a pastor in Oklahoma when the bombs hit. He talked about being a pastor, through a couple of recessions. And he talked about everything that went on, and he says, we're still here, and God is still great. And the thing that struck me was that all of us are going to go through hard times. As a society is going to go through hard times. But God is still going to go through it with us. And God is always going to be there. It really struck me when I listened to Craig Rochelle there, and I want to read David's psalm here, that businesses are going to come and go. People are going to come and go. Churches will fade and new ones will rise in their place. Challenges and tests will come and go. Illnesses will come and go. But through it all, God is faithful. God is there. And I wonder if when David wrote this psalm, he was to remind himself that God was always going to be with him. Not just in the good times, not just when God was doing what he wanted, but just to remind himself that when tough times happen, when tough times, we go through those tough times, that God will be our shelter. God will stand with us. You know, it's easy to be scared of the future. It's easy to be anxious of the future. You know, I've been there. My wife will tell you, if I'm really honest, there's times when I'm like, oh my goodness, what's happening in life? And I'm terrified. And then the next moment I'm like, it's fine, God's in control. And then 2 minutes later I'm like, it's like this. I know some of you are like that as well, okay? I can see smiles on your face and I know some of you well. Okay. You know, when the last 18 months, I was really worried for our church at the beginning of the lockdown. I thought, oh, what's going to happen? But you know what? God has blessed us. God has stood with us. God has journeyed with us through this. You know what? There's times when I've questioned God. There's times when I've got anxious. But God has stood with me all the way through. God has been faithful. You know what? When we feel our anxieties grow, we've got a choice to make. Are we going to feed our anxieties? Or are we going to feed the hope that God's going to bring us through? Because whichever one we feed the most will grow stronger. And the thing that strikes me about David is that he was living, in this passage you read here, he was living for something greater than himself. I read this the other day and it says this. I don't believe this, just to clarify, but this was a quote that I read in a book. So ready to be depressed. It said this: we all know how this ends. You're going to die, and so will everyone you love. Then there will be heat death, and all the change in the universe will cease. The stars will die. There'll be nothing left of anything of infinite but dead, freezing void. Human life, in all of its noise and its hubris, will be rendered meaningless for eternity. That's positive, isn't it? Imagine if that's your view of life, okay, that it's all going to end and everything's just, that's it. The man who wrote that, he was trying to make a point that just enjoy life because you're going to die. He wasn't a Christian, just to clarify. But what the man shared in that book, he wrote that, is this. Is that if you think there's nothing important in life, if you think that you're just going to live, then die, it builds up anxiety in your life. And you're going to get worried. But Jesus came for us to have life and hope. David had hope in God. It drove him forward. It gave him something to live for. And I just wanted for 3 things just quickly. Good 3-point sermon today. I don't often do 3 points, but today I have. 3 things that we can pick up from the psalm to give us hope that we can learn from David. Number 1, David found, there we go, click on the next one. David found hope for the future, but he was driven by his desire to know God. This is what it says in verse 4. One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of my Lord and to seek him in his temple. You know, when we spend time gazing on God's beauty, when we understand who he is and the plans that he has for us, knowing God may not get rid of all our anxieties, but it sure helps. And the thing that David has is he has this hope to know God. When he knows God, he knows that God is going to be with him. Number 2, very quickly, David's hope for the future was driven by his desire to seek God's ways. In verse 11, he said this. He said, teach me your ways, Lord. Lead me on a straight path because of my oppressors. You know, often when we become anxious about the future, it's because we want God to do things our way. Isn't that right? You know, when we don't trust God sometimes, and we say, God, I want you to do this. I want you to do this. And God says, no, that's not the right way. And we say, God, it's all falling apart. If you don't do it this way, it's going to be really bad. And then when we get through it, we realize that God was right all along. Does anyone have those conversations with their children when their children argue with them. I'm sure none of you know what I'm talking about, okay? But if you've got kids, you'll know what I'm talking about, surely. And you say to your kids, you shouldn't do it this way. And they go, no, Dad, I know it better than you. And you go, no, you've got no, that's not going to help you. No, Dad, I know it's better. The next thing you know, they've made a huge, great mess. And you say to them, who knew better? Don't talk to me. And they walk away. Sometimes we're like that with God, aren't we? We're anxious because he won't do things our own way. But David says here, not seek the way that you want to do things, but seek the way of the Lord and see the path that he wants to take you on. I'm really struck by the prayer of Corrie ten Boom when she said these words. She said, God, whatever brings you the greatest glory. God, whatever brings you the greatest glory. I'm coming into land still so your anxiety can reduce. Last point here. David's hope for the future was driven by his desire to trust God. He says this in verse 13. I remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. He trusted God. He was confident in God. Even though what he was going through was not easy, David could see that God had been working. He could see that God had been working. So guys, I just want to finish with 3 practical steps based on these. And if you want to, if you're listening online, follow the link below. If those of you guys in church, if you're not on the internet, you can come pick a little sheet up at the front here. We'll go through it. And if you otherwise, encourage you to scan and download the sheet. But sometimes we go to church and we say, oh, that was lovely. And we go home. But the problem is we forget about it. And so I've got a little sheet here just to encourage us this week to do 3 things. Number 1 is this. Spend time getting to know God. You know, when you're in love with somebody, you spend time getting to know them. You know, when I first started dating my wife, it was nearly 19 years ago. My goodness. Okay, it went on quickly. We would spend hours on the phone to each other, or chatting on the internet, or MSN Messenger, for those of you old enough to remember that. And we would spend ages because we wanted to get to know each other more. We wanted to understand each other. We wanted to do it in the same way as Christians. We need to do that with God. We need to spend time to get to know him. Because if we don't get to know him, we're not going to have hope in him, and we're not going to trust him. So this week, pray, get along to a prayer meeting, spend time with God in church, read your Bible, connect with a Bible study, read some devotional book. But just make sure it's heart knowledge and not just head knowledge. But spend some time with God. And on the sheets, it's got some things you actually commit to spending some time doing some stuff with God, getting to know God this week. The next thing is this. Seek God. Pray for his will and not yours. Pray he would make your way straight and clear for you to know what to do in the situation that you're facing. So, you know, don't be like this. God, I want you to do things this way. Some of you are like this. I know secretly in your room, okay, you're like this. Instead, say, God, I'm feeling really anxious. What do I need to do? Last thing is this. This is what I really encourage you to do. Write the list of as many things as possible that God has done for you in the past. You know, sometimes we just focus on the now, don't we? We don't focus on the past. And it's good, not good to dwell in the past, but it's good to remember the past. And there's so many times for many of you that God has answered prayers. But the problem is when you get anxious, you just focus on the problem that's in front of you. And if you have written down a list of all the times that God has come through for you in the past, when you get anxious for the future, you can say, Jim, or Daryl, or Ben, remember when you were anxious and God did this? Remember that situation when you thought it was hopeless and God did this? And it's a reminder. So 3 practical things. So sheets in here or down below to get the link. But you know, a lot of us are worried about the future. I am in times. But the way to lessen our anxiety is to increase our hope and live for something bigger than just having a nice life. Days of trouble will come, but when you live for something greater, you will know in the end that God wins.